Wondery Plus subscribers can binge all episodes of Ghost Story ad-free. Join Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. This episode contains descriptions of violence and suicide and may be disturbing for some listeners. Please take care when listening.
Right.
Okay. Annie and I are in London again. It's another grey day. Chilly. Just the weather for a woolen vest, which I've been wearing on this trip. Annie liked mine so much, she bought one for herself the day before. We've been spending so much time reporting this story together that we're even starting to dress alike. But I noticed she isn't wearing hers today.
I'm not.
Oh, why not?
Well, I just thought with black it was a little bit too stark.
Do you wouldn't want we're clashing with
You mean
me
you and
in
me?
my vest?
No, if anything, I wanted to match. We could be a reporting team with our uniforms on. I'll wear it tomorrow.
On the agenda for today, visiting my old neighbour and family friend, Charles Pinelli's. Nice to see you, Charles.
Nice to see you.
How are you? You might remember Charles. He's the definitely not a neighbourhood gossip who set this project in motion. The one who first told me about the 3 different families experiencing a ghost on the top floor of my old house.
Anyway, you're going to bring us up to speed, so this is a very big deal.
Well, I think we're going to start with some questions, if that's all right, and then I'm going to bring you up to speed.
I'm not sure it is. I think this is blackmail.
If you eat your vegetables, you get your dessert. I didn't keep him waiting for too long. I told Charles that we'd been in touch with the American family who moved in after me. Can I tell you something, Charles? We've found the Americans.
Oh, well done. Oh, that's the best news.
And they have 2 daughters. And specifically their daughter, Sonia, the woman we talked to last episode, whose bed shook violently.
Ah, that's brilliant.
But really, I was here to talk about the 3rd family, the one who saw the faceless woman. You'll remember that Charles met the mother of this family years ago when he knocked on the door of my old house and she answered. She told him that her daughter had been complaining about seeing the faceless ghost at night in my old bedroom. The mum said she'd always brushed it off, never taken it seriously. And you'll notice I'm not using any of their names here, because months into reporting this, they were still refusing to talk to me. I got in touch with the daughter who slept in the room, the daughter of the mother that you spoke to. We had a phone date this morning, and then the mother found out that I had contacted the daughter and intervened and basically said...
At this very last minute?
Her mother intervened yesterday evening. Here's what happened. After Charles told me about this family's experience, I called the mum, asking to be put in touch with her daughter. She wasn't ready to yet, but she was warm, seemed as intrigued as I was. So I kept in touch, sent her updates. Then things took a turn. She had not answered my calls, or she'd given me an elusive response by email, or she had ignored my messages.
Yeah.
And then she ghosted me. So eventually I just reached out to the daughter, said if there's any time she wants to talk. She agreed to speak with me. And within 45 minutes, I heard from the mother. And the mother said, "Do not contact my daughter. We are not interested in what you are researching." And I tried to explain myself a bit more and to just say, look, I've been trying to communicate with you and I never heard anything. So I contacted your daughter.
Who's also in her 20s. Like, she's not a 13-year-old.
She's an adult. She's an adult.
She must be 23 or 4 by now anyway.
Frankly, it shocked me that she was so upset that I'd reached out to her adult daughter. I'd clearly touched a nerve. That's what I find very interesting about this, Charles, is when I first learned about this story, my initial reaction was that this was fascinating, but I was quite sort of lighthearted about it. But as we've kind of been digging, we've discovered that it's not a lighthearted curiosity.
It's not so funny, no.
I'm definitely feeling it's less funny than I did at the beginning. There are people who slept in that room who it seems are pretty traumatized by what they experienced, which is not what I expected when I started out on this process. The mum's reaction was particularly confusing for me. I get not wanting to participate. I understand not believing in ghosts or thinking this is a silly project. What I don't understand is why me reaching out about a ghost would make her so angry. So that's where we are. And, I'm not discouraged by this, because for me, it reveals that there is something quite disturbing which is happening on the top floor of that house, which is something that I strongly suspected already. But now it's really crystallizing this idea that people on the top floor of that house are experiencing something which has frightened them.
It's certainly fascinating. I mean, that is quite extraordinary.
I reached out to Sonia, the woman who described her bed shaking in the last episode.
Yeah, I can't wait to find out what's the latest.
I wanted to know what she thought about the other family's reaction. And the mother was like, "We don't want to participate in what you're doing. Don't contact me. And don't contact my daughter."
Oh my God.
What do you make of all that?
Oh yeah, the mum's having a reaction. So by you contacting her, she's basically, you're affirmed that the daughter's feelings and experiences are kind of accurate, basically.
The reason we wanted to talk with Sonia is that the mother's reaction reminded me of Sonia's sister, who'd initially been interested in speaking and then abruptly shut down and refused.
I was quite surprised that she wasn't up for speaking about it. But she's always been more sort of... I'm not uncomfortable with the fact that there are paranormal stuff or ghosts or beings or other dimensions. I'm open to that. So, but other people who are very just skeptical would not feel comfortable talking about it because they have no compartment to put that experience into, and therefore they just want to erase it. So when you bring it up, they feel uncomfortable because it doesn't fit into any of their belief scope.
And it's almost like validating that it's true, which would be even
because
better.
they'd have to change their beliefs, and lots of people don't want to change their beliefs. They want to keep them the same, and so anything that doesn't fit, it just gets discarded, and you can't talk about it with them because they just become uncomfortable.
That seems...
I think that's
that
the
seems
main
true.
reason.
Sonia, thankfully, was happy to keep talking. I finally told her about the murder in the house next door, and there were some things from our first conversation that I was hoping to understand better. But then she told me something that surprised me. When we talked, you gave us the story of like the bed shaking.
Yeah.
And then you said that when the bed shaking stopped, you had this very kind of strong feeling in the room. I was just wondering if you could walk me through what that feeling was.
Obviously, it felt scary because it was an unusual situation to be in. But the feeling in the room was just that I was being watched for about 5 minutes. And I got, in my mind, I was like, this feels like a male energy. I feel like his name begins with, I don't know, that's just his name begins with a J or something like that.
Okay, it's really weird that you say this about the name starting with the letter J, because there is someone whose name starts with the letter J.
Oh.
Faither's first name was John.
Oh my God.
From Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios, this is Ghost Story. I'm Tristan Redman. Episode 3, The Locked Door.
From Wondery, I Hear Fear is a new anthology series of suspenseful stories hosted by Carrie Mulligan. These stories are inspired by true events in real places, so the next sound you hear could be your own scream. Stay tuned to the end of this episode to hear a preview of I Hear Fear.
There's a roughly 20-year period from the end of the First World War to the beginning of the Second that's known as the golden age of detective fiction. It's hard to say why exactly people were going so crazy for crime novels. Certainly part of it was that it served a kind of collective therapeutic purpose. The trauma of World War I was so unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. And what these novels promised, in their small way, was that order could be restored. Logic could triumph over mystery and confusion. Things could make sense again. In the United States, there was Raymond Chandler. But most of the big names were British. Agatha Christie, G.K. Chesterton, and a woman named Dorothy Sayers, who along with Christie was known as one of England's queens of crime. Dorothy Sayers wrote 16 crime novels. They were hugely popular. By 1937, when my wife's great-grandmother is murdered, Sayers is a household name in Britain. She's just published a new novel. In it, a man is found murdered inside an old house. All the windows and doors are locked from the inside, with no evidence of a break-in. A classic locked room mystery. Just like what my brother-in-law Hugh Dancy was talking about at the end of our last episode.
It's when somebody dies inside a locked room.
Is that a thing?
Yeah.
The puzzle of the locked room is what nagged at Jackie Moulton, the Scotland Yard detective. If Fayther did kill Naomi and Morris Tribe, how do you explain the crime scene?
The problem with it is to work out how Tribe ended up on the lavatory floor and it's locked from the inside.
How would Fayther have exited the bathroom to then break down the locked door from the outside? In December of 1937, less than a month after Naomi's murder, Dorothy Sayers is at home when she receives a call from a man she doesn't know.
Right. So, is this Miss Dorothy Sayers, the writer?
Who is that speaking, please?
Dr. Dancy of Richmond.
Dr. Dancy of Richmond. That's Fayther, of course. And the conversation that followed, Sayers found it so strange and unsettling that she took detailed notes, essentially a transcript of the call, and immediately sent them to Scotland Yard. So we're going to read it, excerpts of it, like an old-fashioned radio drama. Hugh agreed to play Fayther again.
Right.
Annie will be playing Dorothy Sayers.
Turns out my British accent is terrible.
And off we go.
Is this Miss Dorothy Sayers, the writer?
Who is that speaking, please?
Dr. Dancy of Richmond.
Oh, yes, doctor. What is it?
Well, I know your books. You're interested in crime and so on.
Yes.
Well, my wife was murdered a few weeks ago, and I thought you might like to come and see the place. It's quite a problem.
Good heavens. Well, thank you. I'm afraid detective writers are rather stupid about problems in real life.
Oh, there's nothing to solve. That's all being cleared up. But I thought you would be interested in hearing all the details of the investigation. There's a great deal more than ever got in the news of the world. Did you read about the crime?
No, I don't think I did.
Oh, well, it was a very complicated business. My brother-in-law, he'd had a head wound during the war and was a little unbalanced, shot my wife and tried to shoot me, but I escaped by flopping down and pretending to be dead.
I begin to remember the case now.
I thought you might. I thought it would interest you and help you with your work. You are interested in this kind of thing, aren't you?
Very much, but I'm only in town for a few days.
Come to dinner tomorrow night and I'll show you everything and tell you all sorts of details you wouldn't get from the police.
Just stop there.
Detective Jackie Moulton will be reprising her role as interrupter, stopping us whenever she hears something she wants to comment on.
You're only less than 3 weeks after his wife died. He's calling Dorothy Sayers. Because the first thing that you can imagine, if your wife's been murdered 3 weeks, you think, oh, do you know what? I'm going to give that to a crime writer.
So, back to the call with Sayers. Fayther has just invited Sayers to come over for dinner and tour the crime scene. She tells him that she's busy, but she could come over after Christmas.
All right, well then, if you'd like to come and have a talk about it after Christmas, I'll just give you a few more details to whet your appetite. You are interested.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it very much. That sort of detail is most useful, but this must have been very terrible for you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm rather a philosopher in these things.
A few details to whet your appetite. From here, Father does go into a lot of detail. Detail you don't find anywhere else in the police file.
He'd planned it all out a long time before. He tried very hard to persuade me to buy a razor of a suitable sort. Couldn't use that kind himself because he only had one eye. So he persuaded me to buy one for myself. Then he took a lavatory towel to hold the revolver. He thought that the absence of one towel from the lavatory wouldn't be noticed. He shot my wife, and then he shot at me. The shot was fired from about 14 feet. They can tell that, you know. Did you know they could tell that? Well, then his idea was to make it look as though I had cut his throat. It was very carefully planned a long time before.
Stop. These are totally new facts. Read that bit again, can you?
Well, then his idea was to make it look as though I had cut his throat. It was very carefully planned a long time before.
So, this is new information. He's not told the police that, has he?
Yeah, this is not something that was introduced in the original statement.
Right. The whole idea of him as
Yes.
suspect is coming up for the first time here.
Yes.
I want to spend another moment on this because the logic here is kind of stunning. What Father is suggesting is that Morris intended to kill himself, encouraged Father to buy him the right kind of razor to do it, but was planning to do it in such a way that it would look like Father had killed him. Because according to Father's logic, Morris, after he was dead, wanted to pin his death on Father.
It sounds like one of those complicated crimes that one only thinks happens in books.
Oh, it was a regular storybook crime. He was a fellow who was always reading books, detective stories and that kind of thing.
I'm afraid we tell people too much in our books.
Yes, ha ha ha. I'm afraid so. It was obviously a murder taken out of a book.
Stop again. If I was to speak about the book, can I speak about the book?
Sure,
So the police do recover some interesting items in Tribe's room. They find some methylated spirits. They find cocaine. They find some photographs of nude women. And they find a book, fictional book called Murder in the House. So it's almost like a bit of a Cluedo game, isn't it? That these items are conveniently, in the room.
To clarify, it's in Morris's room that police find these seemingly incriminating items: alcohol, drugs, pornography, and a book called Murder in the House. Father says that Morris loves reading crime novels, but he's also reporting that Morris is losing his eyesight.
Dancy talks about the evidence that Morris could hardly see. He'd lost one eye and the other eye was failing. So then he tells police he read these murdered books all the time. And then he's saying he could hardly read. He can't see. So he's hardly an avid reader, was he?
Back to the phone call.
And then we got the police, and of course they had to go into a lot of questions in their usual way, so keen on the wood that they couldn't see any of the trees, to show that I hadn't done it myself. They had to be sure I hadn't cut his throat myself and got out through the lavatory window and then broken the door afterwards. Then another point, there was blood on all four walls of the lavatory, but there was no blood on me, and there were no blood stains or marks on the window where I might have got out.
Just stop there. Is he saying to Sayer actually what happened?
What do you mean?
Can you read it again?
Yeah.
They had to be sure I hadn't cut his throat myself and got out through the lavatory window and then broken the door afterwards.
He's telling Sayer, this is how I did it. That's how I read that.
Jackie's suggesting that in this conversation with Dorothy Sayers, Father may have been outlining the answer to the locked door mystery. Father would essentially be saying, if I'd done it, well, I'd have had to have climbed out the window, come back into the house, and then knocked the door down.
I'd like to know, for example, where that lavatory window is and how, is it on a flat roof? Can you access the ground?
So what would you want to do? You would want to go and see that window?
Yes, everything. Yeah. I would want to go and see everything, yeah.
We have seen the window. Would you like to see a picture of it?
Yes.
Okay. The window opens out on the left side of the house. It's high, 25 feet or so. Too high, in my opinion, for someone to scale or jump down from. But Jackie immediately notices something.
So he could scale down the drain pipe.
There's a drain pipe that runs underneath the window and then down the house to the ground. How easy would a drain pipe be like that to scale down there?
No, that's not difficult, would it be? That's what burglars used to do, didn't they? Go up and down drain pipes, yeah.
As far as why Father called Dorothy Sayers to tell her this, Jackie has another theory.
So he's actually saying they're missing stuff, is he not? That's what I got from it.
How do you read that? Like sort of gloating?
Yes. Gloating.
I thanked him again, and I said I was sorry I couldn't come Thursday, but might possibly manage Friday.
Friday? Oh, yes, come Friday. Only, of course, I shall have had to put back some of the things. For instance, I must put back the bolt on the lavatory door. But I can show you most of the things, and we can have a talk about it. If you come Friday, don't give your real name.
Not my real name.
No, my daughter's coming home, and she's read your books and would recognize your real name. She's 14, and she doesn't know anything about all this yet.
Very well, if I come, I'll use my married name, Fleming. I'll let you know if I can manage it. Then he gave me the address and telephone number.
That must have been a surprising phone call.
Yes.
Yeah, he plows on, doesn't he?
When the transcript of the conversation between Father and Sayers landed in the hands of police, the case was already closed. The last official document in the file is a letter from the police to Dorothy Sayers responding to her memo. They acknowledge that the call is curious, but they tell her basically, don't worry about it. The responding officer writes, quote, I feel certain the case will never be reopened.
Poor old Morris Tribe, his whole character destroyed. He's remembered as the man who killed his sister. I don't think he did.
Ever since talking with my wife's Uncle Mark, I've been trying to take his warning seriously. Don't be sensationalist. Remember, this man is beloved by much of the family. But when you line up all of Jackie's concerns and try to make sense of this bizarre phone call, it doesn't really feel irresponsible to go along with her hunch. Frankly, it feels like Father got away with murder. Coming up, I do what any in-law investigating a murder in his wife's family would do. I get a second opinion.
I'm about to play a clip from I Hear Fear. Follow I Hear Fear on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Shh. Stay quiet. Don't move. Did you hear that? Sounds you hear in the middle of the night. Or when you're deep in the woods. Or alone, walking down a dark street. You tell yourself it's just your imagination. But what if it's not? From Amazon Music and Wondery, I'm Carey Mulligan, and this is I Hear Fear, a new anthology series that will make you bolt your doors and hide under the covers. My favorite thing in the world is a brilliant ghost story. And nothing scares me more than a story inspired by real events and real horrors. From a deadly dance party to a cursed movie set. The sounds of terror are all around us. Warning, The next sounds you hear might be your own screams.
Binge all episodes of I Hear Fear ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts.
Convincing as Jackie was, I couldn't go to my wife's family and tell them Father committed murder based on the opinion of a single detective. So I need to get a second opinion on the police file. Due diligence, dotting I's, crossing T's, etc.
Hi.
Hi, Hamish.
Hi, Tristan.
Hamish Campbell retired from Scotland Yard after 39 years, but he used to be basically the murder guy in London.
I was head of homicide in the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard, in charge of the 26 murder teams which operated across London.
He investigated murders. He ran the teams that investigated murders. He ran the teams that investigated the way police were investigating murders. He's seen a lot of murder. So I started with the obvious question. What would be your one-sentence headline from reading that police file for the first time?
I would say it was quick, but correct.
What do you mean?
Well, the investigation was done very quickly, phenomenally quickly. Do I think the observations and findings of the investigation were correct? Yes, I do. I do see it as murder and suicide.
And what do you mean by a correct outcome?
Well, I understood why it was murder and suicide, and I can see from the investigation that was done how that would be the outcome.
If as you say, if you can't tell, I'm pretty flummoxed here. I have to be honest that you kind of caught me off guard.
I noticed.
Because right before speaking with you, we spoke with another homicide detective who had nearly the opposite interpretation of the police file, and that the crime was most likely not a murder-suicide, but a double murder. So what do you make of that disparity?
Well, I'm not sure. I'd want to know who the detective was who came to that conclusion. But the premise that somehow the doctor murdered his wife and then murdered his brother-in-law doesn't stand up, in my view. I don't see that at all.
Hamish is focused on a piece of evidence that Jackie was much less bothered by.
Your other detective, how did they address the post-mortem report?
The post-mortem report. He sees this part of the file as the closest thing to something scientific.
You know, the post-mortems are so critical. You've never been to a post-mortem, have you, Tristan?
I have not. The doctor goes in, examines the bodies, and writes down what he sees. In this case, when he looks at Morris's body, his neck in particular, the doctor concludes that Morris most likely killed himself. I just want to give a quick warning here again. We're going to get into some graphic details.
And when I looked at it, I sort of broke down the pathologist's statement where he talks about the 3 wounds are indicative of hesitation and trial.
3 wounds indicative of hesitation and trial. The pathologist calls these hesitation wounds. Hesitation wounds are common in suicides by this method. They essentially show the person working up the nerve to go through with it. The cuts on Morris's neck seem to show this. The first 2 are shallower and smaller. The third is fatal. And this pattern, the pathologist said, is consistent only with suicide. You don't see these kinds of wounds in homicides.
That is the indicative piece of evidence. I don't know how the other officer examined that and thought, I will completely disregard the pathology evidence.
I wasn't prepared to take Hamish's word for it. He isn't a pathologist after all, so I called one.
I mean, the evidence screams, medical evidence screams to me, homicide, suicide.
From pathologist Tom Andrews' perspective, the hesitation wounds are conclusive. Morris killed Naomi and then himself. But I asked him if another scenario could be possible. Perhaps Father knew that hesitation wounds were typical of suicides and was able to mimic them precisely. He's a doctor after all.
I think given the nature of these hesitation wounds, those are exceedingly hard to fake. I have been a forensic pathologist for many, many years, and I'm not certain that I could fake hesitation marks as cleanly as this.
And for Hamish, the faking hesitation wounds line of inquiry is borderline ludicrous.
He's had to kill Tribe and make it look as if it's self-suicide because he might know what hesitation wounds look like, and he's done that and there's no other error. Yeah, I mean, you'll forgive me, but that's where the argument goes down rabbit holes.
There's another piece of evidence Hamish points us to that supports the murder-suicide verdict. It comes from Morris's sister-in-law, a statement she wrote to the coroner. In it, she writes about Morris.
I always thought it was a possibility that he might commit suicide. He once told me that if he killed himself, he would cut his throat and that he knew where it should be done. So that's where I'm starting from. So I'm afraid for me, he committed suicide.
If Hamish is right and Morris committed suicide, then the chances that Father killed Naomi are slim. His account of what happened that night would hold up. With this evidence as the backdrop, the rest of the suspicious stuff that Father does seems like no big deal to Hamish.
Have people been murdered for their insurance money? Of course they have.
The insurance policies, for instance.
Of course they have, all over the world. But it's not like it's suddenly taken out. The other one's expiring and they've upped it. And the reason it's up is for both of them. So he's protecting both himself and his wife. I don't see that as a reason to go and murder her.
As for Father's bizarre behavior in the crime scene, like when he washes Morris's hands and then moves the razor from the floor to between Morris's fingers.
That is an odd thing to do, but nevertheless, I don't see it as necessarily suspicious because he needn't to do that at all. It's almost so what? He did do it. It doesn't change the story.
And then, of course, there's the phone call to Dorothy Sayers less than 3 weeks after the murder.
You don't know about people in high trauma, post-event catastrophe, how they react. He's the victim of a terrible crime in his house, you know.
Maybe he's just freaking out.
Yeah, people can behave irrationally.
Armed with the hesitation wounds, Hamish is able to write off the inconsistencies one by one.
I don't write them off. They exist and they're present, but I don't interpret them as evidence that Dancy killed his wife and his brother-in-law.
In general, Hamish's calculation comes down to an Occam's razor theory. Whatever scenario is most likely is probably the correct one. Who's more likely to have killed Naomi? Her disturbed brother who was struggling with PTSD and alcohol? Or her husband, a respected doctor?
In the circumstances of this household and what we know about Tribe, his injury, his, I don't know, is it a mental disturbance of some sort? I mean, years of post-war disability on drugs, medication.
I did a little digging around on this topic, and the stories from this era are horrifying. This is 2 decades after World War I. The newspapers frequently ran stories of former servicemen doing terrible things to themselves and others. I spoke with a historian who's written extensively about the effects of shell shock on British society after World War I. She told me a strikingly familiar story. Her own great-uncle, a shell-shock veteran struggling with depression, one day out of nowhere slits his girlfriend's throat and then his own. The story Father tells about Morris may not have been that unusual.
So someone murdered the wife, the husband, or the brother. There's no evidence to show that it was the husband who killed his wife. Could he have done it? Of course he could. Everything has possibilities, doesn't it, in murder? But do I think with all the other material and the background to the case and the way they lived their lives and who they were, I think it's extremely unlikely.
So where Jackie saw a locked door mystery, Hamish sees a locked door.
To get the door lock broken, he's had to kill Tribe lock himself into the toilet, climb out the window. I mean, it's becoming a bit fanciful by now. You have to deal with what's more likely and probable as opposed to what's unlikely and improbable. Is it impossible that he did all these things? No. Is it likely, though? It's pretty unlikely.
After our call with Hamish, my head was kind of spinning. I thought I was just going to Hamish as a formality. After talking to Jackie, the gaps in the case seemed glaring, and I was so focused on how I was going to tell Kate's family that Fayther might be a murderer that I just assumed Hamish would have a similar read. And now we had a very different problem, with two extremely qualified detectives giving us completely opposite verdicts. We had to figure out which one of them was wrong. So,
okay, my name is Dr. Alfred Titus Jr.
I'm a criminal behavioural analyst, formerly of New Scotland Yard.
We got a bigger sample size.
I'm a professor and criminologist. I was also a police officer and detective for 16 years.
Retired NYPD.
I'm just going from my 27 years of working cases.
We assembled a kind of informal panel of 6 murder detectives with decades of experience. And what was your solve rate?
The last 3 or 4 years, we were at 100%. We had 100% solve rate.
It was about 95%.
I'm not trying to brag, but it's pretty damn good.
Actually, I did some maths. Between them, the panel has a collective 174 years of experience.
I can sit here and tell you I solved all of my cases, but one, and I'm going to sit here and tell you I had 2 divorces.
We sent them the file and asked them for their assessment. And they all had the same answer. What would you say is your one-sentence headline after having reviewed the case file?
Dr. Dancy did it.
Dr. John Dancy has a clear motive.
For me, there seems to be only one person who does gain in this scenario.
I would say he was absolutely involved.
And that's Dr. Dancy.
Every single one came back with Fayther as their main suspect.
Nobody knows for sure but John.
I believe it was homicide by Dr. Dancy.
They noticed things we didn't see in Fayther's statement.
First of all, I went into it with no preconceived notion of whether he was a murder-suicide or a double murder. But when I read his statement, I knew it was baloney. That's when I knew he did it.
This is Cloyd Steiger. He was a homicide detective at the Seattle Police Department. One part of Fayther's statement did it for him. Which part of it?
Okay, here it is. Dr. Dancy, he hears the shots. Tribe shoots at him. He says he went to the lavatory and tried to open it. He called on Tribe to come out and give him the gun, but he replied, "Stand away from the panels or I'll shoot you like a dog." So he did all that first. Then he went into the room. She's dead there. He found her on the bed, shot through the eyes, blood spurting from one of them. That's his exact words. There's a legal term for phrases like that.
What is it?
This is bullshit. This is all bullshit. Because, first of all, like a shot to the head, a brain, you're dead almost instantly. It'll spurt for about 3 seconds or 2 seconds. So when he says blood was spurting out of her right eye, bullshit. He did not see that. That's an absolute lie. Let me change that. He may have seen it, but if he did, he was standing right next to her when he fired the shot, when the shot was fired. That's the only way he could have seen that. No other way. Zero chance. That is a physiological fact.
The panel pointed out problems that seem obvious now.
To be looking at a gun that was supposedly on the floor next to Maurice, you have a gun and you have a razor, and you're going to kill yourself. Who the hell would pick up the razor and cut their throat?
Like, they all doubted that Morris would have used a razor blade to end his life when he had a revolver with 3 rounds left in it.
So there are firm stats on preferred method of suicide by age, by gender. Slitting one's throat is less than 0.5% of all suicides.
You don't see people that cut their own throats. Not one time have I seen it. Not one time.
The truth is, this point stands whether Morris killed himself or Fayther killed him. Why would Fayther choose this incredibly difficult way of killing Morris if he had a gun right there? Why would he slit his throat? The detectives had thoughts about that too.
He might have killed Tribe first, because his wife was asleep and you could do that quietly. Whereas if he shot her first, Tribe would go running, what happened, you know?
There's something curious about this scenario though. If Fayther had attempted to kill Morris, Morris would have fought back, and you'd expect to see defensive wounds, bruises, nicks on the arms or body. But there's nothing of the sort. Only the wounds on his neck.
That's the other thing. I want to know what the toxicology was. What was Travis' blood alcohol level, right?
Unless, of course, the detectives pointed out, Morris was knocked out. In fact, several of the detectives wanted to know whether Morris had been incapacitated before he died.
There's no toxicology report.
Even though the technology existed at the time, the pathologists didn't do a toxicology report on Morris. Maybe because they didn't suspect anything.
So we don't know if Dancy, shot him up with morphine or any other kind of drug to incapacitate him, and him being a doctor, he's got the wherewithal to do a lot more than a regular Joe could do. He's got drugs, he's got medical knowledge.
Remember Fayther mentions in his statement that he was giving injections to Morris to treat his failing vision? He gave them to him every Monday, the same day the murder happened. This all seems pretty suspicious, but we hadn't yet talked about the one piece of evidence that Hamish thought overruled all the others. I want to ask you about the hesitation wounds, because that was kind of a key piece of evidence for the pathologist.
He described them as hesitation wounds. Were they hesitation wounds or were they attempts to cut his throat? Because when I first heard this, to be honest, when I read the first things, I just scanned through it and then I saw hesitation wounds. Oh, hesitation wounds. Yeah, it was probably self-inflicted. Then I went back and read the whole thing in depth and looked. That doesn't really sound like hesitation wounds to me.
Cloyd disagrees with the pathologist at the time, and he just thinks the wounds are too deep to be hesitation wounds.
Because hesitation wounds generally are very like a scratch.
How do you know that?
I know how hesitation wounds are because I've seen them several times. But in the skin, because it's hesitation, once you start cutting into the skin, it's not really a hesitation wound anymore because that hurts a lot.
The so-called hesitation wounds didn't move the needle for Cloyd, and none of the other detectives even brought them up. So, if we got this panel together to get clarity, I guess we got something close to that. Here were 6 new detectives wholeheartedly agreeing with Jackie, and Hamish way out on a limb on his own. For those of you keeping track at home, that's 8 detectives we've spoken to, 7 of whom point to Fayther as their main suspect. But despite that, I didn't feel a lot of clarity. Hamish's point about the hesitation wounds was nagging at me. I wasn't so sure it could just be rejected so quickly. And the pathologist, who insisted hesitation wounds would be virtually impossible to fake, he said one thing in particular that stuck with me.
You don't see that kind of planning and delicacy trying to fake hesitation marks. I don't even know who would think of that. That's awfully diabolical.
Actually, this is one of the only things that all the detectives agree on. For Fayther to have killed Naomi and Morris and staged the crime scene, he would have to be sort of the perfect criminal.
If that's the case, we're talking about, a clinical psychopath.
He played this through like a cinematographer. He probably thought about it every day and he thought of the perfect crime.
And Fayther? What are the chances he's secretly a criminal mastermind?
What kind of person was Dr. John Dancy?
Well, that is a very good question, and it's the question that I spend almost all my waking hours thinking about. So, Dr. John Dancy is my wife's great-grandfather. He's a doctor. During the First World War, he becomes a spy.
Oh.
Oh, yeah. Did I mention he was a spy? Why'd you make that noise?
Because he knows stuff. He's trained in this type of stuff.
What type of stuff?
Like getting away with murder.
That's next time on Ghost Story. Follow Ghost Story on the Wondery app, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. Before you go, tell us about yourself by completing a short survey at wondery.com/survey. Ghost Story is a production of Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios. It's hosted by me, Tristan Redman. Our lead producer is Annie Brown. Our senior producers are Chloe Prasinos and Jess Hackle. Our producers are Zandra Ellen and Emerald O'Brien, and our associate producer is Natalie Peart. Joel Lovell is our editor, with fact-checking by Maximo Anderson. Theme song and music by Daryl Griffith, supplied by APM Music, with mixing and original music by Hannes Brown. Pineapple's head of sound and engineering is Raj Makija, with assistant engineers Sharon Badales and Jade Brooks. The senior audio engineer for Ghost Story is Davey Sumner. Jess Hackle was our senior producer of development. Our artwork was designed by Brian Kluge. Legal services for Pineapple Street by Rachel Strom and Sam Kate Gumpert from Davis Wright Tremaine, Crystal Tupia at Odyssey, and David Hurst from 5RB. Our senior producer for Wondery is Michelle Martin, with producers Brian Taylor White and Grant Rutter. Rachel Sibley is the managing producer for Wondery, and Sarah Mathis is the coordinating producer. Our executive producers at Pineapple Street are Maddie Sprung-Kaiser, Max Linsky, and Jenna Weiss-Berman. Our executive producers for Wondery are Morgan Jones, Rich Knight, Marshall Louis, and Jessica Radburn. And special thanks to Richard Quinn, Chris Potter, Susie Grogan, Damian Allen, Alison Vermeulen, and Barney Lee, as well as all the detectives on our panel. That's retired US homicide detectives Christine Menina, Cloyd Steiger, Dr. Alfred Titus, and Wendell Stradford, and former detective, now criminologist, Michael Arntfield, as well as Laura Richards, former criminal behavioral analyst and domestic abuse expert for Scotland Yard. And special thanks from me to the memory of Richard Moore. This episode contains public sector information licensed under the Open Government License version 3.0. Wondery Plus subscribers can binge all episodes of Ghost Story ad-free. Join Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. Have you ever heard about a ghost haunting not the house that something bad has happened in, but the house next door or a nearby place?
So have I heard of a house that's haunted because something's happened next door?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically spirits have got free will. So if they die in their house, but there's people next door, they might want to nip next door and see what the neighbours are doing.
If you'd asked me a year ago what I thought about people who make their living hunting ghosts, I would have said they're scam artists, or total loons, or totally loony scam artists. But people change. I mean, who wouldn't want to nip next door and see what the neighbours are doing, right? That was before I learned of the girl living in my teenage bedroom and the faceless woman who would come to her in the night. And before I met Sonia and heard about her shaking bed and whatever her sister experienced, which was so traumatic she can't talk about it all these years later. And now I found myself thinking, maybe people who spend their days hunting ghosts are exactly the people we need to talk to.
We're not scientists, by the way. Let's get that clear.
So, a few months ago, Annie and I tracked down every ghost hunter and paranormal expert we could find in the UK.
I'm curious if you perform exorcisms?
No, that's not our bag. Where are you on the rankings of the big paranormal investigation companies?
We're at the top by far.
People who've been in the business for years and really honed their craft.
It's hard in ghost hunting because there's no degrees for this.
We all have our own different belief system. We all have our own different methods.
I'm more kind of old school, so I believe in energy levels.
We are more pragmatic. We want to go out there and do it.
How long have you been doing this for?
Together, 8 years.
Yeah, it's about 8 years now.
Yeah.
The first guys we sat down with operate as plainclothes ghost hunters.
So one of our niches is that we are one of the few groups that go into people's homes privately.
And they told us to steer clear of those they see as lesser professionals.
Keep an eye out for red flags.
The people that wear uniforms, you know, with the badges and...
paramilitary uniforms. So that's my advice.
Too late.
Can you describe your emblem?
Okay, so the emblem, I designed the emblem.
We were already meeting with the people in the uniforms.
It's basically a replica of an American police badge.
Is there a bird at the top of the logo?
Eagle. It is an American eagle.
We even visited one of the leading manufacturers of ghost hunting equipment in the UK, a place called Spirit Shack.
How did you come up with Spirit Shack?
You know, I came up with several different ideas. Spirit Shack just sounded a little funky. And there's another company called Radio Shack that design radios.
So should we be thinking about Spirit Shack as like Radio Shack, but for spirits?
No, Radio Shack's a completely different company.
We told them each what was going on in the house on Queen's Road, my yellow vase moving around, and they had a few different theories.
Things moving is extremely rare. Like I said, that's poltergeist activity. It's extremely rare.
Several of them thought it might be a poltergeist, the kind of ghost that's trying to tell me something.
They want your attention, and they will get your attention by throwing something at you or moving something, an object you may have placed somewhere.
I believe that only a demon has the power to do something like that.
One thought my ghost might be a demon. And demons, it turns out, have a nose for the vulnerable among us.
I don't really want to say the weak-minded because I don't want to be insulting, but some people are more open to being possessed. So demons will usually pick the weakest target mentally.
The weakest target mentally? Offense taken. And lastly, another guy thought there might not be a ghost at all. Instead, he thought there might be something growing behind the wallpaper. What do you mean by mold behind the wallpaper? You're talking about like psilocybin sort of hallucinogenic mold?
Yeah.
He suspected I might have been tripping.
Sounds great. But I'm not saying that you lived in a very dirty house or anything. But unfortunately, we have to rule out everything.
Okay, well, ask me now what I make of ghost hunters, and I guess I'd say that some of them might definitely be scam artists. And no doubt, a bunch of them are a little loony. But I'd also say the best of them, they might be up to something much more interesting than I'd given them credit for.
I will look at a lot of the cases and I will think to myself, I'm not sure that there's a physical thing that's actually happening here. 95% of probably what we hear about is actually something that's being projected from the person. Psychologically, they think these things are happening.
Which isn't to say that they don't believe there are ghosts out there, poltergeists, whatever. But they're also just much more open-minded about the many ways that a person can be haunted.
People get into this sort of this feeling that they've got to find an explanation for their life and the sorry state they might end up, no money, ill health. And one of the explanations is the paranormal.
Our methods are not to go in and to make them believe in ghosts, because I believe people haunt themselves.
And apparently all you have to do to unhaunt yourself is to talk about it.
What you're actually providing is some sort of care. Being able to talk to somebody about it, you know, that old adage about a problem shared is a problem halved. I think it's very true.
Nick, what you're describing here, it sounds to me like really a kind of psychological support you're giving people.
Yeah.
Not that talking about the ghost makes it go away. Actually, none of the ghost hunters are even interested in getting rid of ghosts. But somehow acknowledging it's there takes away its power to haunt you.
You know, we're very much like, look, you guys need to live here. You know, you need to learn how to relax in this place as best you can. And through that, they feel they're not alone.
Do you feel like people misunderstand what you do?
Yeah, people do misunderstand what we do. They see us just as, you know, Ghostbusters, and but we're not. We're more than that, because we're helping members of the public with traumatic experiences, things that they're going through. People haunting themselves, and we're trying to make them unhaunt themselves, basically.
Which I guess makes you wonder.
Do you think that Tristan could be haunting himself?
No. I think he had a genuine haunting. I think you had a genuine haunting myself, because what's amazing and miraculous is how Tristan's life has panned out, that he's landed up with Kate. I believe that's fate and destiny. It's all happened for a reason.
From Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios, this is Ghost Story. I'm Tristan Redman. Episode 4, The Advantages of Believing.
Jack Dancy had just joined the British Secret Service. It's the beginning of 1915, and he's about to enter Britain's first spy school for a crash course on intelligence, which lasts just over a month. Hitherto, however, we've had little idea what the new recruits were taught because they were strictly forbidden to take notes. Dancy disobeyed that rule.
This is a BBC documentary from 1988. The Jack Dancy they're referring to here is Father, of course. So far, we've met him as the Dancy family patriarch, but outside the family, he's also been known as one of Britain's first international secret agents.
His is the only account to come to light of training at Britain's first spy school. It's a unique record of how law-abiding English gentlemen were taught the art of unscrupulous behavior.
This documentary and the memoirs it's based on might help us understand a key question the murder detectives raised in the previous episode. They all agreed that for Father to have killed his wife and his brother-in-law, he would have to have been capable of extreme calculation and deception. So what kind of man was he? We found someone who spent a whole lot of time trying to answer exactly that question.
What are you opening here?
I'm opening a file that I kept at the time, which describes everything that happened from the first phone call, and it's labeled John Horace Dancy.
This is historian Nick Heinley. His experience nearly 40 years ago grappling with who Father was left such a mark on him that he's kept all the documentation of what happened. Do you remember where you were when you first learned about the writings of John Dancy?
Yes, I was living in Cambridge, and I got a phone call.
Nick was working in 1987 as a young academic at Cambridge University, studying the history of British espionage, when he got a call from his colleague.
He rang me and told me about the material that had been shown to him.
The colleague had just got his hands on a rare document, a handwritten memoir of a former British spy.
I then went and picked up this suitcase full of hard-backed, lined notebooks, at least a dozen of them.
A literal suitcase.
A literal suitcase, yeah.
The suitcase was full of Father's memoirs, the nearly 3,000-page document he wrote that now lives with my wife's uncle Mark Dancy, who we visited earlier in the series. But it wasn't just the size of the document that impressed Nick. It was the intimacy, a door being opened that had always been shut tight.
Well, I should explain what working on the history of the Secret Service was like in those days.
Yeah.
This is before any official files had been released to the National Archives.
At this point, in 1987, the British government had revealed almost nothing about the inner workings of its intelligence agencies.
So, I would still, if I went away for a research trip somewhere and came back with 5 pages of material, new material, I'd be delighted. So when I get a phone call that tells me there are thousands of pages of intimate detail, this is just astonishing. Quite unlike anything we were used to dealing with, the little puffs of steam that escaped from under the lid of the official pot. It was unprecedented. It immediately felt that this should be published.
So, Nick starts editing the memoirs down, and at the same time, he and his colleagues start collaborating with the BBC on the documentary about Father.
What is the documentary called?
Well, the documentary, there's a piece of publicity here for it, a publicity postcard they produced. And it says, Time Watch, the diary of a very English spy.
I have been admitted into a complicated new world through locked doors. My slate has to be wiped clean of relations and old friends.
This is the 80s, so the documentary is full of slightly grandiose music and cheesy reenactments of scenes from the memoirs. But these are Faither's actual words come to life.
It will be an entirely new life, which requires me, in a sense, to change into a different person.
The film depicts a small group of well-dressed gentlemen sitting in spy school, the teacher lecturing in front of the class.
Lying is in effect our profession. You are a man of mystery, a man who knows something his enemies do not know he knows.
Hardened criminals would be brought in from prison to teach the cadets how to break into buildings and get back out again without being seen.
If properly performed, this maneuver can be done in broad daylight. You'll now have the advantage of seeing the expert do it.
Faither recounts meeting the head of the spy agency, who tells him why he's uniquely qualified to be an effective spy.
You react strongly under pressure and have a quality of alertness which I'm looking for in my men. You're also a doctor, the last person to be suspected if anything should go badly wrong.
Up until this point, historians like Nick had understood the spying business to be amateur work, patient observation, maybe photographing some documents. But what Faither describes on the eve of the First World War is an agency that's much more sinister.
Dunsey's diary gives us a unique, unparalleled insight.
This is Nick, by the way, in the doco.
He talks openly about ethical liquidation, that it might be useful to incorporate murder in the new ethics of the Secret Service.
What was ethical liquidation, as you put it?
Authorizing, ordering, carrying out somebody's murder for the greater good.
Human lives are no longer to be cherished and prolonged, for they are now expendable.
Faither talks in his memoir about a particularly upsetting class in spy school, one he called the butchery class. In it, he remembers being shown how to cut a man's neck. He says the teacher, quote, showed us the precise position of the heart and of the carotid arteries in the neck, and with it, the right sort of knife with which to approach them. It was about 5 inches long, razor sharp down both edges, to give it the best start possible.
One of the striking things about the manuscript is that it's continuous and unbroken. It has this sense of omniscience. He doesn't admit anywhere to not knowing things.
Nick is bewildered by the memoir, not just the intimate window it provides into the life of a spy, but the knowingness of it, the sheer authority of Faither's writing.
Most people who work in Secret Service would leave a memoir that said, I knew what the people in this department were doing, and, we saw them at work, and I met them in the canteen, but we had no idea what they're up to. No, he doesn't leave any gaps like that. He knows everything. He knew everybody, and he was present at every event.
But before the memoirs can be published, Nick needs to verify them. No easy task, but he digs in. And soon, Nick finds himself caught in a web that almost 40 years later, he still hasn't totally escaped from.
What if your partner developed 21 new identities, or you discovered that your friend who helped you through your darkest times was actually a conniving con artist? Or what if you began seeing demons everywhere inhabiting people, including your son? What would you do? Stay tuned to the end of this episode to hear a preview of the newest season of This Is Actually Happening.
So, it's 1987. Nick Hiney is elbow deep in Faither's 3,000-page memoir, trying to verify what he can of Faither's vast, intimate knowledge.
I've gone here from assessing what we can cut out in order to publish it, to thinking about the way that it was created.
Nick was dumbfounded that at the end of his life, when Fayther sat down to write his memoirs, he remembered dialogue, names, dates. So Nick wonders if Fayther referenced anything else to jog his memory while he was writing the memoirs.
So what could he have used to spur his memory? And in particular, I was interested in a book by a journalist called John Bullock called MI5. So I started to look at the text of MI5, and I immediately started to see passages that had been copied out.
Word for word?
Yes.
Passages copied out, word for word.
He takes turns of phrase, he takes descriptions, he takes events. Now, that's not too bad, because he might just be jogging his memory. But then there are examples where he takes passages from Bullock's book and he changes the dates in order to fit his own narrative. He's not simply using the text, but he's changing it. Now, I wrote to Bullock because I thought we'd better be clear about this. Did you have any contact with John Dancy?
Did you think that Dancy might be a source of Bullock?
That's quite possible, you see. So you've got to make sure that that wasn't the case. So I got in touch with Bullock, and he said no, he'd never heard of John Dancy.
Not only has this author never heard of Dancy, but Nick finds another book that Fayther seems to have plagiarized. More passages copied out, more facts taken, then changed. And suddenly Nick is starting to doubt the veracity of everything in the memoirs.
I have all sorts of notes to myself about, is it possible to point to any single piece of uncorroborated evidence in the narrative and swear that it is true?
After months spent with the memoirs, Nick is outright angry at Fayther. All these years later, he still has every document related to them, including all of the notes he wrote to himself. He pulls a page out of a file and reads it to us.
It says, Dancy was a conceited, methodical old bore with hang-ups related to violence, discipline, loyalty, and honour. Comes out of my reading of the manuscript, trying to understand the man behind it and finding a very strange character. So, obviously, I was not happy in his company.
And so now, the question is whether he can even move forward with the project.
I didn't feel that I could be involved because I couldn't trust the document, and I could not imagine a process where you could edit it. But it would be like a butcher carving rotten bits off a piece of meat and selling it to the public. It's not something you can readily do.
After Nick had spent many months working on this project, what started out as potentially the most thrilling discovery in his young career ended in disappointment. Nick holds back his vitriol and submits a sober, unemotional assessment of the memoirs to his colleagues on the book project. He writes,
I've been reading through the First World War sections of John Dancy's manuscript with a view to estimating their suitability for publication. I've read them very carefully and have reluctantly come to the opinion that they're too unreliable to be published. So this is a very careful document.
It reminds me of an MP's resignation letter.
Yes, I was going to spend more time with my family after this. But it had to be written so carefully because it was heretical to write this.
Why? Why was that heretical?
Because the publishing process was pretty far advanced.
I went back to Nick on this question after our interview because it was such strong language. Why was it heretical to say these things? He said, so many people were so invested in it. Fayther had captivated all of them. They all wanted it to be true, just like Nick had for so long. Now he was telling them that their excitement about the memoirs, everything they'd wanted to believe about them, was wrong. Nick laid out the facts, and they were undeniable. And so the book project ground to a halt. It would never be published. But the BBC went forward with the documentary. We asked them why, but they declined to comment, saying it happened too long ago. Strangely, as you heard above, Nick agreed to be in it. This is 4 months after you write this letter.
That's right, yes.
Saying that you think this is all gobbledygook and you don't really want to be involved anymore.
I don't think those are my exact words.
Sorry, I'm paraphrasing lightly.
Well, I have to say, knowing that you were the one who discovered the plagiarism, watching the documentary, it seems like you're lending your credibility to the text.
Yes, that's true. But looking back, I went too far. But then the alternative was just pulling out, which didn't seem. I don't identify with the strange young man in the jacket and tie in the documentary.
Looking back, something that Nick feels particularly uncomfortable about is the part of the memoir that deals with Faither's murder training. Those scenes in the documentary about the butchery class, learning the precise way to slit a person's throat. He's never found any evidence that supports that. So that scene that was recreated in the documentary, what does that seem like to you now, in hindsight?
Well, now in hindsight, knowing a lot more from the official documents, it is an invention based on fiction. It's a fantasy.
I couldn't help thinking that Nick was a kind of unwitting accomplice to a much larger pattern of deception than even he knew. I asked him if he saw it that way.
I think that's very true, yes. Did he fool us all? I think people were desperate to believe in this remarkable document. As always, the advantages of believing are so enormous and outweigh the penalties of disbelieving that you're kind of drawn towards believing them.
What are the advantages of believing this?
You make television programs and publish books.
I see what Nick is saying here, that there was some tangible benefit to believing in these memoirs. And giving up that belief meant that all the work these academics did would have been basically for nothing. But I think there's something else going on too. Another advantage to believing in this. That if you start to question your beliefs, if you start to consider that you might have been wrong about something you believe so strongly, you start to question your own judgment, your own confidence in what's real and what's not. And those doubts are much scarier, I think, than losing a work project. There's loads of reasons you'd want to avoid a feeling like that. Anyway, Nick thought he'd put this whole ordeal behind him. He took all of his research, stacks of annotated pages of Faither's largely fictitious memoir, and put them into deep storage, presumably never to be looked at again. Until, a decade later, Nick learned something that makes him reconsider whether Faither's account was a total lie. Here's what happened. In 1997, the British government decides to declassify a huge number of documents related to their spy agencies, and they release them to the public. And as Nick reads the documents closely, certain details start to stick out to him. Details that make him wonder about Faither's memoir.
Some of Dance's descriptions of individuals are very accurate in terms of agreeing with the sources that we now have.
But didn't at the time. These newly declassified documents, they reveal that Faither knew things at the time that he couldn't have known without being an insider. Little inconsequential things. For example, he knew that the nickname of a certain high-ranking spy in the office was Stan, even though the man's name was Fred.
Dancy says he was Stan in the office. That's something nobody could have known in the 1970s unless they had some personal experience. It's a little detail, but there are other small details like that.
And he knew the identity of a shadowy senior operator that Nick says historians had entirely missed.
We hadn't spotted him, but he's very prominent in Dance's manuscript.
And these details, they leave Nick confused about who Faither really was and how much he can completely reject his account.
It does appear that he had some involvement. And there were many, many people who were peripherally involved with MI5.
Nick wonders if Feyther may have been a kind of trusted collaborator. There were hundreds of these, he says. People who were well connected, went to the right universities, belonged to the right clubs. As a doctor, Feyther may have fit this description.
Then it becomes very difficult to know what to do. And I'm still stuck with that problem. I would love, in something that I'm writing at the moment, to be able to quote some of Dancy's opinions of particular MI5 officers whom he seems to have met. But how can you do that if you distrust the document?
What does that feel like, to feel still tethered to this document somehow intellectually all this time later?
It would have been convenient if I'd never seen it.
I know exactly how Nick feels. Once you're inside Feyther's world, it's like being stuck in a hall of mirrors you can't get out of. You can't tell what's real and what isn't, where the lies begin and where they end. We started with the question, what kind of man was John Dancy? Our first answer was an international spy, trained to live a double life, to get in and out of buildings without being noticed, to slit someone's throat with a straight razor. Pretty grim. Definitely someone who'd be capable of pulling off a double murder. But it turns out that answer isn't exactly true. Our second answer, the real one, is that he was a wildly extravagant and successful liar. A fantasist even, who may have had something to do with spying, but only pretended to be trained in murder. Is that kind of person capable of killing two people?
I'm about to play a clip from This Is Actually Happening. Follow This Is Actually Happening on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
In my wife's system, she described it as like a big house. Everybody had rooms, and then they had a common room. Everybody had their own space, and they could come and commingle together in the common space. She described it as if she was an observer, like the person that walked around was like the host. That's what she called it, the host, because it didn't have a name. It was just like a vessel, like you put a key in an ignition and drive a vehicle. It was just a tool. So she was aware of the conversations, but she was never involved in them. So it would be like heated discussions between like Paisley, which was the 17-year-old, and she wanted to go on a date. She wanted to go flirt. And the mom part would be like, no, that's inappropriate. You're married. And Paisley would be like, well, I'm a 17-year-old. I want to go have fun. So they would talk with one another. And sometimes she would tell me that she'd just be sitting there and they would be having conversations. Blaze was the part that was in charge of finances. She was pretty much always out. Paisley was always out. Sophie was always out. But the only one that I never saw interact with anyone else was the decimator, which was the male part, which was pictured as like an abomination, as like a creature. That one I never saw interact with anyone other than me.
You can listen to This Is Actually Happening early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts.
Despite the plagiarism in the memoirs, the Dancy family was upset when they didn't get published. Feyther's son wrote letter after letter begging Nick to reconsider, to publish the memoirs as a work of semi-fiction. A bit like Nick's academic colleagues, he so badly wanted Feyther's story to be true that he couldn't fathom that it wasn't. And it seems to me, from my conversations with Mark Dancy, Feyther's grandson and the present-day holder of the memoirs, that that's where he still is.
I felt at the time that it all ought to be published, really. And we discussed whether to publish it, perhaps a bit edited, but basically his version. Make it plain that its provenance was a little uncertain. But the academics wouldn't do the work, basically. because they were worried for their reputations.
Mark knows that Feyther made things up, but he sees the fabrications as harmless exaggerations, almost a charming eccentricity.
It's this sort of completely, pretty much unnecessary sort of little deception that he gloried in. He absolutely loved it.
Why?
That was his mind, you know. You know, he loved putting one over people. I think he gloried in a deception well executed.
And Mark sees this whole attempt to make head or tail of Feyther's stories as something that would have really tickled the man.
That's the way Feyther worked, in a sense, you know. He'd be delighted to think that people couldn't decide either way about it. He sort of liked to sow uncertainty. Extraordinary man.
I mean, it leaves you with a sort of sense of frustration.
Yes, but I can see Feyther laughing in heaven, if you see what I mean. You'd have been laughing at all the effort that has gone in to try and unravel all this, and that nobody can be quite sure.
Yes. It was a bit awkward to be sitting with Mark while he was relishing Feyther's love of deception. At the time of this conversation, I was still in the middle of reporting the night of the murder, still speaking with detectives and trying to understand. I wasn't totally clear on how I felt about all this, so I hadn't yet shared any of my reporting with Mark. But in this moment, I was distinctly aware that while Mark was saying one thing, I was hearing something else.
On whatever level you take what he wrote, it shows a certain brilliance. Well, if it was a deception, it shows a rare talent in deceit.
Mark's theory is that Feyther just lied for the sport of it. But later in our conversation, Mark said something that sounded to me like a more likely motivation, psychologically speaking.
You know, he arrived home without a particular job to go to, I think, and Naomi was still struggling along doing her work.
We were talking about Feyther coming home from World War I, and like thousands of veterans at the time, he couldn't find steady work.
And he had to try and pick up the pieces and found it extremely hard going, I think. And he was a sort of second-class citizen, I think, to a certain extent, you know, because she was the breadwinner.
What do you mean a second-class citizen?
Well, because he wasn't bringing anything into the family, requiring a wife who was working really hard to support him. And Naomi, I don't know how sort of solicitous Naomi would have been. She comes across to me as being pretty hard.
Hard in what way?
Well, I think she's so focused on her work, you know, and the fact that she's doing things which women hadn't done before, that she may have resented the fact that she had to go home after a hard day's work and look after someone who was a pale shadow of his former self. And, you know, someone of his sort would have found it very difficult to handle a sort of loss of status, maybe. You know, men were men in those days.
So, maybe, and to be clear, this is my theory and not Mark's, maybe Feyther told all these grandiose lies because he was ashamed of the reality of his life. Maybe his memoir is just an attempt to pass on a much more heroic story to his kids and grandkids. But that lie meant there were other stories he didn't tell. Don't you think it's strange that when he sits down to write the story of his life, he makes no mention of the fact that his wife was murdered in the family home? Naomi is mostly absent from the story Feyther tells. When she does appear near the end, one of the main things we learn is that she was a stickler about lying. Feyther tells us Naomi is the reason he left the spy service. She didn't approve of it and wouldn't marry him unless he gave it up. Feyther writes that Naomi had, quote, read somewhere that every successful spy had to be a murderer at heart. So he blames the end of this potentially fictional career on his very real wife? That's kind of it. In the story Feather passes on to generations of Dancies, he essentially erases Naomi's legacy. And that's got to have some effect on the family.
Again, going back to the family legend, Feather is this domineering, intellectually powerful adventurer. Naomi wasn't present.
Here's my brother-in-law Hugh again. Naomi's absence from the family's history came up during one of our occasional conversations about the project.
I mean, putting aside any kind of mystery about her death, it's just that story of great female accomplishment didn't exist in that form.
And with Naomi gone, what remained, Hugh thought, was explicitly male.
I mean, I grew up with this strong sense of a through line from Feather to Grandad in particular. Something that was handed down, but also kind of with a great big shove of drive and achievement, male intellectual achievement. That felt like an absolute thing.
The thing I've been asking myself is, did Feather intend to erase Naomi? Is that why he wrote the memoir the way he did? And it seems like, in the backdrop of this whole conversation with Mark, about Feather's love of deception, about his prolific lying and his bruised ego, is a question. Do these things add up to a kind of motive?
I mean, the thing that's difficult for me to fathom is whether he worried at all or whether he hurt anybody in the process. The question arises as to whether he was ever violent.
And then, it was like Mark read my mind.
You don't get the feeling that his tendency to like deceiving people would ever have a violent outcome, if you see what I mean. And obviously I'm sort of alluding here to Naomi and all that.
What do you mean?
Well, we've established that he had this tendency to deceive, which makes him a deviant of a sort, because most people don't behave like that. And the question is whether his deviance was sufficient to make him kill, which I don't believe.
After leaving Mark that day, my concern about how this project might affect him only got stronger, and he made his feelings more and more clear to me.
If you come out with a piece that says, he was a murderer, then I will be sorry that we ever said we would contribute to it.
Frankly, I was pretty terrified to fill Mark in on what I'd been learning. I put off having that conversation with him for as long as I could, which was good, because in the meantime, months after this first interview with Mark, the family found something. A large brown envelope buried beneath a pile of old papers. Inside that envelope was a stack of letters written by Feather in the years just before and after Naomi's murder. And Mark was convinced they would change my mind about Feather. Next time on Ghost Story, we dive into the letters and we sit down with a woman who first received them more than 80 years ago. A woman who knew both Feather and Naomi intimately, who can weigh in on their relationship in a way that no one else can.
My dad would never have killed my mom. He loved her.
Follow Ghost Story on the Wondery app, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. Before you go, tell us about yourself by completing a short survey at wondery.com/survey. Ghost Story is a production of Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios. It's hosted by me, Tristan Redman. Our lead producer is Annie Brown. Our senior producers are Chloe Prasinos and Jess Hackle. Our producers are Zandra Ellen and Emerald O'Brien, and our associate producer is Natalie Peart. Joel Lovell is our editor, with fact-checking by Maximo Anderson. Theme song and music by Daryl Griffith, supplied by APM Music, with mixing and original music by Hannes Brown. Pineapple's head of sound and engineering is Raj Makija. with assistant engineers Sharon Badales and Jade Brooks. The senior audio engineer for Ghost Story is Davey Sumner. Jess Hackle was our senior producer of development. Our artwork was designed by Brian Kluge. Legal services for Pineapple Street by Rachel Strom and Sam Kate Gumpert from Davis Wright Tremaine, Crystal Tupia at Odyssey, and David Hurst from 5RB. Our senior producer for Wondery is Michelle Martin, with producers Brian Taylor White and Grant Rutter. Rachel Sibley is the managing producer for Wondery, and Sarah Mathis is the coordinating producer. Our executive producers at Pineapple Street are Maddie Sprung-Kaiser, Max Linsky, and Jenna Weiss-Berman. Our executive producers for Wondery are Morgan Jones, Rich Knight, Marshall Louis, and Jessica Radburn. And special thanks to Calder Walton, Carol Sennett, Matthew Lockwood, Alison Vermeulen, and Barney Lee. This episode contains public sector information licensed under the Open Government License version 3.0. Wondery Plus subscribers can binge all episodes of Ghost Story ad-free. Join Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. Recently, I've found myself thinking a lot about Sherlock Holmes. Not like there's got to be some clue here that would unlock this whole story, some Holmesian solution to the locked door mystery that would finally reveal Naomi's killer. It's nothing like that. In fact, I don't think about Sherlock Holmes in relation to the murder at all. I think of him when I imagine talking to the ghost in my teenage bedroom. Or more to the point, I think of his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
When I talk on this subject, I'm not talking about what I believe. I'm not talking about what I think. I'm talking about what I know.
That's Conan Doyle, the guy who created perhaps the most rational, evidence-obsessed character in the history of literature, describing his absolute certainty that we can talk to the dead. In fact, he was sort of the celebrity spokesperson for what was a much larger movement. World War I had left millions dead, and those who survived were turning to the paranormal for comfort.
It was only in the time of the war, when all these splendid young fellows were disappearing from our view, the whole world was saying, well, what's become of them? Have they dissipated into nothing? Or are they still the grand fellows that we used to know?
One person Conan Doyle pointed to as proof that we could speak with the dead was the magician Harry Houdini. Houdini was also world famous at this point, mostly as an escape artist, but also because he would perform seances as part of his act. He'd bring audience members up on stage to contact their dead loved ones, and Conan Doyle was enthralled. Now, Houdini, he knows it's all a trick. The crowd who comes to see him, they so badly want to connect with those who died that they're easily fooled. The illusion gives the people what they want. But when the two men become friends, Conan Doyle refuses to believe that Houdini isn't the real deal, and no amount of protest by Houdini can change Conan Doyle's mind. For years, their friendship survives this disagreement. Until that is, Conan Doyle convinces Houdini to put aside his skepticism for one night. Houdini had been grieving the loss of his mother, and in a desperate attempt to contact her, he agrees to sit with his friend and a medium in Atlantic City. Houdini closes his eyes and follows the instructions to summon her. The medium begins automatic writing, channeling the spirit and spilling everything it says onto the page, or in this case, 15 pages. Houdini's mother appears to the medium and makes the sign of the cross. She speaks to her son in English. Houdini is silent. He doesn't mention that his mother was a rabbi's wife and would never make the sign of the cross, nor does he point out that she'd never spoken English in her life. But inside, he's disturbed, distressed that his friend actually believes this stuff and is convincing other people too. And eventually, what was a private disagreement becomes a full-blown public rivalry. Houdini makes it his mission to debunk this whole pseudoscience of the paranormal. He even testifies before Congress on it. He says it's, quote, a fraud from start to finish. When a congressman calls Conan Doyle an outstanding authority, Houdini responds, no, he is one of the great dupes. Friendship over. End of story. Except, a few months after that congressional hearing, Houdini suffers a ruptured appendix and is suddenly on his deathbed. After years of waging war on all things paranormal, he does something surprising. He tells his wife he'll try to communicate with her from the beyond. He promises to send her a message if he can. And for the next decade, she tries to summon her husband every year on the anniversary of his death.
We have waited, Houdini, oh, so long. Never have you been able to present the evidence you promised. And now, this is a night of nights. The world is listening. Harry, your world, your audience.
This is a recording from the night of the final seance. After years of not reaching Houdini, they give him one more chance to show up.
Harry, we are all seekers after truth. Please manifest yourself by speaking through the trumpet. Speak through it, speak. Speak, Harry. We are watching and waiting, Harry.
They wait.
Do it, Harry. Please. Please, Houdini, we are waiting.
And wait.
If there is communication from the great beyond, come through with the evidence.
And nothing.
Houdini did not come through. Good night, Harry.
The thing that sticks with me isn't that Houdini was right. It's that at the end of his life, he so desperately wanted to be wrong. It reminds me of what historian Nick Hiley said last episode about the advantages of believing, just in a pretty different context. Houdini devoted so much time to debunking the existence of the paranormal, but when he was at death's door, the advantages of believing in an afterlife were so great, the comfort it provided so reassuring, that he was willing to put down all the evidence he had to the contrary. After years of thinking his friend was a gullible dupe, in the end, even Houdini wanted to believe. From Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios, I'm Tristan Redman. This is Ghost Story, Episode 5, The Bulletins. You might remember that in Fader's statement to the police, he tells the cops that on the night that his wife was murdered, he was awake in his study, typing a letter to the children. He wrote these letters every week. They were called the bulletins, updating the kids on how he and their mother were getting on at home. All 3 children were away at boarding school. Bindle, the youngest, their 13-year-old daughter, had just left home that autumn. Bindle was at this school on the day after her mother was killed. She was sitting in class when the door opened and she was told to report to the headmistress's office.
They took me out of a class and they said, do you know where the headmistress lives? And I said, yes, she lives in that house back there. And they said, well, you go over there, the headmistress wants to talk to you. And I went in there, what did I do? Headmistress. And she said, I have to tell you something sad. Did you know that your Uncle Morris was going to visit at home? And I said, no, but he comes often. She said, well, I have to tell you, your dad asked me to tell you that he shot your mother. I didn't believe it. I mean, things like that didn't happen to the type of family I lived in.
85 years after that day, I went to visit her.
I've heard so much about you.
Well, Bindle, I have heard so much about you.
And it's nice to be called Bindle. Nobody calls me Bindle anymore.
She was named after her mum, Naomi Marigold Dancy, but her family always called her by her nickname. Am I allowed to call you Bindle? I know.
Of course you are. Of course you are. That's a part of the family thing.
Bindle is nearly 100 and living in a nursing home in West Virginia. She's been in the States for almost 80 years, so she may have lost her English accent, but she still looks like a Dancy. The same long, graceful neck that my wife Kate has. And she's smart like a Dancy, breaking into 17th century verse at the drop of a hat.
Fair daffodils, we weep to see you haste away so soon. As yet the early rising sun has not attained his noon.
Though with some healthy American bluntness.
Fancy having to memorize that crap.
I came to see Bindle for obvious reasons. She's the only person alive who knew Father and Naomi together. If Father did indeed kill Naomi, as all but one of our murder detectives suspected, presumably Bindle would have noticed something. There would have been signs of strife, of resentment, of anger, of something.
Oh, it was marvelous. We had a wonderful life.
Well, not if you ask Bindle.
Lots of picnics, lots of rides in the car. We didn't just ride in the car. Dad sat in this car with the top off, singing all the way with Dad punching the horn.
What songs would he sing? What was his favorite song to sing you?
Oh, well, cruising down the river on a Sunday afternoon, the moon above the stars.
Her earliest memories are mostly of her dad, because her mum wasn't around very much.
Mom worked. She got off on the train early in the morning, and I used to walk down through the gardens with her sometimes, and she'd get on the train and go to London to work.
Naomi spent long days working in London, delivering babies and caring for them in hospitals there. She worked grueling hours, then made her way home late at night.
And I didn't see her that much. I mean, I think she was a very good mother. She taught me all the things she's supposed to teach me. But I think she was more interested in caring for poor children and things like that. She figured we had everything. She enjoyed her babies so much. And she felt that they really needed her.
When you say she loved her babies?
The babies that she delivered. She had to teach the mothers how to look after them and keep them clean. That was her job. She was good at it.
How did that make you feel to think that your mum was more interested in spending time with other children and not with her own children?
I just figured that she was what people called a good person. Mom was the one supporting the family. Dad was doing a lot of things that women did.
Was there ever any tension between your parents over this? Did your dad feel ever resentful towards your mum because she was working and he wasn't?
Oh, no, not resentful. He wanted to look after her and make sure that she was looked after when she came home tired. And he wanted to make sure that the house was taken care of so that it would be nice when she got home and that we kids were dressed and clean, and he'd taken us for long walks and taken care of us well.
It wasn't just that Father made sure the house was in order. He made everything fun, Bindle said, like putting on magic shows for the kids and their friends.
Dad was terrifically good at that. It was just like, all of a sudden, there'd be a bunny rabbit came out from behind his ear. He'd do it to us all the time, you know. That's like, how did that get there? The little mouse must have been under my shirt.
Was he funny when he did his magic tricks?
He was a riot. He was the best father in the world.
That's kind of Bindle's mantra about Father. He was the best father in the world. She said it many times in our chat. I suppose it's hardly surprising that a kid would have such a glowing perception of her father. But there really wasn't a hint of any family strife. Never a critical word about Father. After a while, I started to wonder how much of it was nostalgia. Like it served her better at this point in life to wear these particularly rose-tinted spectacles. And who could blame her? But then, months into my reporting, the family found a whole trove of documents that largely corroborate Bindle's memories. Buried under some papers in a brown envelope were dozens of the weekly bulletins Father wrote to the children at boarding school, all from the years before and after Naomi's murder. Would you be open, Mark? I mean, this is a question obviously for Johnny as well, but would you be open to sharing the letters with us, please, the bulletins?
Well, Johnny hasn't seen any of them yet until I physically hand them to him because they're not in any other form. I can't answer that.
It took a long time for my in-laws to decide to share the letters with me. By that point, honestly, it felt like they didn't totally trust me. I think they were worried that I'd comb through them looking for anything that would help me build a case against Father. Annie tried to assure them that we were just genuinely interested in them, whatever they contained.
What has it been like reading those bulletins?
Well, it brings him back to me. He was a very amusing man, and to my mind, very kindly as well.
But I think once they read the letters, they recognized the man they remembered. So they sent them, almost 200 pages in all, and we dove in.
First bulletin for the winter term, 1937. My dear children.
Here's my brother-in-law, Hugh, reading again his Father.
A little new carbon paper and some extra thin typing paper, and away we go, just as merrily with 3 of you to write to.
Most of the letters are just musing on everyday life.
The weather is terribly cold here and has been for the last few days, so my thoughts have flown.
There's one where Father writes to apologize for sending Bindle's brother back to school with football boots that are the wrong size.
I felt so sorry about it that I could have cried, and Mum and I were completely put off our breakfast. I know exactly what it is like to have to play in boots too small, and I have prayed many times that this shall never befall any of you.
He clearly misses his kids, and he begs them to write home more.
Don't you decide which letters to me is interesting. They all are, and I keep them all. When I am old and utterly bald, I shall have nothing else to do but read them over and over.
He writes about how he and Naomi are keeping busy now that the children have gone.
We have cleared Mick's room and dance almost every evening. She's learning a good deal about the dancing and improving rapidly, although she wasn't too bad before, as you know.
In fact, Father can be quite complimentary of Naomi.
Do you realize that Mum will be 50 soon, and she looks about 30? Some people say she looks far less than that.
In the weeks before Naomi's murder, Father writes to tell the children that their Uncle Morris has come to stay at the house.
We have poor old Morris here again. He began to lose the sight of his sole remaining eye a week ago and got very nervous about it, quite naturally. So we asked him here to stop for a while. He vents all his spite of poor Mum. He feels so savage sometimes with her that he says the most spiteful things.
The letters say that Naomi went to stay with her mother the week before the murder when Morris came to Queen's Road for his treatment.
All the same, we must not forget that he is badly wounded and we have a responsibility towards him for that. I read the paper to him at breakfast. He chips in irritably with caustic comments upon any of the public characters.
There's another letter, written the following week, that really stuck with me. Father and Naomi have just come home from visiting Bindle. They sometimes call her Whittle. He writes about how on the ride back, their car tire gets damaged and they have to drive the long way home quite slowly.
Mum was exceptionally good company and we enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed the whole of it, which is saying a lot, for I usually hate these long drives. Mum and I felt very much happier about Whittle after seeing her at the school. We hear you will be at home on December 18th. What ho for the holidays! We will have a marvellous time, won't we? With love and kisses to you all, from Mum and from me.
They wouldn't be celebrating Christmas together. Within days of this long, slow drive, Naomi would be dead. And before reading these letters, a big part of me suspected that the man who killed her was the same man writing these words. But Feather's tenderness towards Morris, towards Naomi, towards the kids, it's hard to square that with the guy I get from the police file, or with the way the murder detectives talked about him, like he was some kind of criminal mastermind. If my in-laws decided to show me the letters because they'd hoped they'd snap me out of whatever fantasy I was constructing about Feather, well, it worked.
My parents had a really unusually gentle marriage. My mom would complain, she'd say, "Oh, I'm getting fat." And he'd say, "You're not fat, Nay." He says, "You're just beautiful."
What did your mom say?
"Oh, Jack."
Have I just got this man completely wrong?
What if your partner developed 21 new identities, or you discovered that your friend who helped you through your darkest times was actually a conniving con artist? Or what if you began seeing demons everywhere inhabiting people, including your son? What would you do? Stay tuned to the end of this episode to hear a preview of the newest season of This Is Actually Happening.
I was over a year into this when I first read Feather's letters. And when I did, it was a wake-up call. How could I have been so far off? Why had I been so quick to entertain the possibility that he was a murderer? It's not like doing this was some lark. I knew from the beginning how uncomfortable my in-laws were about it. Several members of the family had decided not to participate because they were so upset by the idea. Mark's warning was now ringing in my ears.
If you come out with a piece that says he was a murderer, then I will be sorry that we ever said we would contribute to it.
But it wasn't just me, right? There was only one detective who thought Feather definitely didn't do it. All the others had pointed to Feather as their lead suspect. So I decided to reach out to the one holdout on our panel, Hamish Campbell, the one who thought the hesitation wounds were incontrovertible evidence.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better, Hamish. I wanted to know how he would explain why all the other detectives suspected Feather.
A good question, but to be honest, I don't know why they think the way they think. But do you think maybe some want to sort of find a more fantastical or exaggerated position of the case? Then yes, I do.
That instinct towards the more dramatic conclusion, the better story. Hamish says he's seen it a lot in his career.
You see that in so many cases where people want to see another explanation. And in the vacuum of information and the absence of hard fact, you place incorrect thoughts and ideas, and you then build on them. You just build up a whole case, but in fact, you've created something out of nothing.
He listed half a dozen murder cases where the media, the family, even other officers offered up theories that were darker, more conspiratorial than the one right in front of them. They'd latch onto it, start seeing signs of it everywhere, only to have the real outcome be totally mundane.
You know, unfortunately, some cases are relatively straightforward. You know, they're not all Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers investigations. They're just sad, tragic, small events of time and life.
What Hamish is identifying is a kind of perverse desire that I think many of us have, to want murders to be more exciting than they are, more true crimey.
I sense you're looking for a mystery. Perhaps the mystery is there is no mystery.
Okay, sure, but what's actually driving that? Why do people come up with these theories that certain cases might be more exciting than they actually are?
Tristan, I don't know. You have to. You could ask yourself that question.
What do you mean?
Well, because what's driving you in this case? I sense a real belief from you, Tristan, that you want it to be Dr. Dancy killed his wife and killed his brother-in-law. I think you're looking in the shadows and finding shapes.
I don't know, maybe he's right. Maybe I've been looking too hard for something that's not actually there, trying to wedge pieces of a puzzle together that don't actually fit. Except with this story, it's not like one side is obvious and boring and the other's completely fantastical. Sure, if you believe Feyther did it, then you'd have to accept some pretty extreme things. He drugged Morris. He faked hesitation wounds. He climbed out the window, shimmied down a drain pipe, and burst back into a locked bathroom. But if you believe Feyther didn't do it, you have to accept a bunch of equally extreme other things. He dodged bullets that whizzed past his ear. He washed Morris's hands and placed the razor back in his grasp for no apparent reason. He called Dorothy Sayers weeks after his wife's murder, just for the hell of it. In fact, to believe in his innocence or in his guilt without a smoking gun requires just that, belief. The kind of belief that's based less on irrefutable hard facts and more on what you want to be true. In any case, it was kind of a relief to read the bulletins, to settle into the idea that maybe Feyther didn't do it, now that I had a clearer view of the man. So, I mean, basically, the bulletins kind of totally changed the way I thought about him because they show him as this kind of quite devoted family man.
Because suddenly you're empathizing with him.
Yeah. As usual, I laid all my thorny feelings at the feet of my wife, Kate. Because as I spent more time reading the letters, certain details started to emerge. It's not all great for him either. There are a few things that really kind of stood out to me and I was quite surprised by. So I don't know if you remember in the police statement, basically Feyther talks about giving Morris injections every Monday. The first odd detail comes from a letter a few weeks before Naomi's murder. So Morris is in the house. He's come for his weekly Monday injection. And Feyther, he writes to the kids, "It is 11 p.m.
It is 11 p.m. Morris is safely asleep, as I have given him an injection to keep him quiet."
Now, an injection to keep him quiet. My understanding from speaking with doctors was that the most likely thing that Feyther was injecting Morris with was vitamins, which is sometimes given to people for failing eyesight. But Feyther is admitting in the bulletin that he's giving Morris an entirely different type of injection altogether. You might remember that a bunch of the detectives on our panel wanted to see the toxicology report for Morris, but the investigators at the time never did one. Several of our detectives suspected Feyther could have drugged Morris.
Does he say I injected him and sent him and knocked him out, or does he say I gave him his medicine?
All he says is, "It is 11 p.m. Morris is safely asleep, as I have given him an injection to keep him quiet."
Yeah, it's an unfortunate turn of phrase.
There are two kinds of Kate laughter. There's the real kind and that one, the kind that shows up when she's uncomfortable. I mean, okay, so the other thing that really stood out to me is that basically 2 weeks after Naomi's murder, in the first letter to the kids after the murder, a woman shows up in the letters.
Okay.
I mean, her name is Mary Garstin, right? She's 17 years younger than him. In that first letter, Feyther tells the kids that this woman, Mary, is helping to take care of him. Feyther even has a nickname for her, Mousy.
Mousy, by the way, is one of 3 people who have been good to me. Mousy has been constantly on the phone to hear how things are and has done a lot of sewing for me.
After that, she starts showing up in the bulletins pretty much every week. And by that autumn, she'd be co-writing the bulletins, signing off the letters with Feyther, "With love from Mary and Dad."
Yeah, I 2 weeks is not very long. So I think it's definitely, that's really quite odd. Unless she happened to be very close with Naomi, for instance, that we don't know about. And she's there as a friend of Naomi's and her best friend has just been killed.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. We don't know whether Father and Mary knew each other before Naomi died. She lived just down the road and worked as a nurse, but there's no mention of her in the letters before this. By the end of the year, though, 12 months after Naomi's murder, Mary and Father would be married. Mary came up briefly in my conversation with Bindle. She told me Father married her out of convenience or some sense of duty. The letters, though, say something else. If you read the bulletins, you get a slightly different take on what Father's motivations were. And I think money is very high up the list of priorities.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, he mentions a few times early on that, Mary has got money.
Mm-hmm.
Mary's dad is also wealthy. He's called Mr. Garston, and he's also moved into the house on Queen's Road. But then a few months before he marries Mary, he writes this in the bulletin to the kids. He says, "I can see that there will be big alterations, my dears."
I can see that there will be big alterations, my dears, and you need not imagine I'm doing this with my eyes shut. I've seen it coming, and I've been working for it for a long time. I mean to satisfy Mr. Garston and hang on to him for the rest of his life.
Father does hang on to him for the rest of his life. And when Mr. Garston dies in the house a few years later, he leaves behind around £10,000. That's almost $700,000 in 2023.
Okay. I mean, at least he's honest about that.
A few years after their marriage, Mary gets pregnant. Bindle says her dad was excited about the prospect of another child. What's interesting is, despite becoming Father's second wife, Mary is only a bit part in the Dancy family story. And maybe that's because Mary isn't around for very long.
I'm about to play a clip from This Is Actually Happening. Follow This Is Actually Happening on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
In my wife's system, she described it as like a big house. Everybody had rooms, and then they had a common room. Everybody had their own space, and they could come and commingle together in the common space. She described it as if she was an observer, like the person that walked around was like the host. That's what she called it, the host, because it didn't have a name. It was just like a vessel, like you put a key in an ignition and drive a vehicle. It was just a tool. So she was aware of the conversations, but she was never involved in them. So it would be like heated discussions between Paisley, which was the 17-year-old, and she wanted to go on a date. She wanted to go flirt. And the mom part would be like, no, that's inappropriate. You're married. And Paisley would be like, well, I'm a 17-year-old. I want to go have fun. So they would talk with one another. And sometimes she would tell me that she'd just be sitting there and they would be having conversations. Blaze was the part that was in charge of finances. She was pretty much always out. Paisley was always out. Sophie was always out. But the only one that I never saw interact with anyone else was the decimator, which was the male part, which was pictured as like an abomination, as like a creature. That one I never saw interact with anyone other than me.
You can listen to This Is Actually Happening early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts.
Do you know what the family story is about how Mary died?
In childbirth.
That was the family story I was told by your dad as well. But Bindle told us a different story. I walked Kate through this story, but this is what Bindle told me. It started with a call from her brother.
I was at university by then, and I remember Mick calling me up and saying, Bindle, you better come home. Dad's going to need help. Mary just died. So I cut math class and got on a train and came home.
How did she die?
She got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, pregnant, and Dad had told her not to get up in the night, and if she had to go to the bathroom to call him, and he'd take her.
Why did he say that to her?
Because he thought she might fall. But she didn't want to wake him. And she got up and she fell and hit her head, I think. When she passed out and died.
There are a lot of new details flying by here, so just to recap. Feather's future much younger wife shows up in the bulletins 2 weeks after Naomi dies. Within the year, they're married. A few years later, she gets pregnant and then suddenly dies one night on the landing. The family says she died in childbirth, but Bindle says she died by hitting her head. So I looked into Mary's death. And it seems there was no autopsy done at the time because her death wasn't regarded as suspicious. She had a kind of anemia, and the death certificate says she'd fainted. But I did find out that the doctor who examined the body and signed off on this almost certainly wasn't a stranger. So one of Feather's colleagues, a doctor that he knows, comes to the house and certifies the death. Feather is there as a witness of the death, and then his colleague friend certifies it.
So there's a level of trust there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't look great, does it? But it also could just be a sort of a ton of circumstances that stack up and you end up asking tons of questions, or you wouldn't have asked any questions about it if you hadn't have thought about this stuff before.
No, exactly. But that's the thing, right?
And Bindle didn't ask any questions. And she's clearly never has.
Bindle didn't see anything odd in any of this.
And has never seen anything odd.
But perhaps the most bizarre detail I've come across has been nagging at me for a while. It's about a song that Feather claims to have written. Remember he was a songwriter? I read it both in Bindle's personal memoir and Feather's. So I tracked down the song. And the lyrics are interesting. It's called I Married a Wife. Would you like to hear I Married a Wife?
Sure.
Okay.
I married a wife, oh then, I married a wife, oh then. I married a wife, she's the plague of my life, and I long to be single again.
The song starts pretty tame. Standard man complaining about the old ball and chain.
I married a wife, she's the plague of my life, and I long to be single again.
But then, his wife gets ill.
My wife, she died, oh then, my wife, she died, oh then. My wife, she died, and I laughed till I cried. I was glad I was single again, again and again.
The man is thrilled to be free at last. Except, he finds himself in a similar predicament.
But I married another, oh then, I married another, oh then. I married another far worse than the other, and I long for the old one again.
It's a very sick sense of humour. I mean, if what everybody says that he's this guy who's very eccentric and has a gift of gab and is all like silly and playful with the kids, maybe that's like the biggest joke for him to say that he wrote that.
Is that a joke in very poor taste, or is it a confession?
He doesn't say he killed them. Just says I married them, then they died. And I married another one and missed the other one.
So you don't find that disturbing?
You can imagine that's like a sick joke. I'm a guy who's lost 2 wives, they both died. I'm going to make a joke on that. And it's my joke that this song has come out. Oh yeah, I wrote that. Because it sounds funny.
Yeah, I mean, I can't square that with a guy who writes tenderly about his wife in his letters to the kids.
Makes you feel a bit sorry for Naomi.
And Mary.
And Mary. Sorry, yes, I just don't know so much about Mary.
Yeah.
But sure, the plague of my life is quite strong. I mean, maybe the guy's really messed up by the time, you know, imagine he's innocent. He's had a really shit time. And at the end, he's just making stuff up. He's just,
Still, there aren't really very many generous interpretations of it for me.
Yeah, it's weird. It doesn't necessarily mean he killed her. He could have enjoyed being single again. Like, I'm sure lots of people become widowed or whatever and might actually feel relieved in some way. Doesn't mean that they necessarily killed in order to become a widow.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. This is kind of tough for me. Is Kate just not hearing things the way that I'm hearing them? Is one of us bending the truth more to our liking? Kate isn't one to get frazzled. She's extremely even-keeled. But I could hear her getting frustrated with me. I am not coming to any conclusions myself. I'm not trying to paint your...
You are a little. I'm just saying, the links to the murder have to be clear or it doesn't make any sense.
And that laugh again.
I mean, we're going to be more traumatized by this podcast than we were about the murder, I'll tell you that.
Why do you say that?
Because, but carry on, stir it up some more. What else happened?
Katie.
Go on.
Oh dear.
How are you feeling about all of this?
Well, I'm actually feeling pretty mentally exhausted from those interviews. Annie and I were driving through England on a reporting trip when even she put me on the spot about this.
I mean, but can you acknowledge that at least there's a part of you that wants Feyther to have done it?
I will acknowledge that it's a thing that I worry about in myself all the time, yes. I don't know, it's really hard because the idea that I just want Feyther to do it because it's a better story is a very hard idea to swallow, and it's quite a hard thing to admit to yourself. And there are moments where I really worry that that's what I'm actually thinking. But there are other moments where I'm hang on, this is not madness to think that there are serious questions here. But it's very hard to distinguish between when you're actually seeing something as suspicious and when you're wanting it to be suspicious.
I sort of have a theory about this, which is that I think as more and more people get upset with what you're finding, the pressure internally to have what you're finding be true grows. So as more and more people get upset with you, I feel like you want this thing to be true so that it's worth it. It's worth having upset all these people.
I half agree with you, and I half totally disagree with you.
Okay. All right. Tell me about the...
Because for sure, there is a tendency to think, okay, right, well, it's really important to find... In retrospect, I think Annie is probably more than half right here. She's calling me out in the way Hamish did, the way Kate did. All of them telling me that I have something to gain by believing Feyther is guilty. Not just because I'm a reporter and I want the most exciting story, but because it would be upsetting, embarrassing even, to put my family through all of this only to find out that there's nothing to it. So there's a part of me, I'm sure, that's if I can prove Feyther did it, then it will have been worth it. But there's another big part of me that wants the opposite, that really wants to believe wholeheartedly that Feyther didn't do it, that he was the man they all think he was. Partly because that would make the conversation I'm about to have with Kate's family a lot easier. Next time on Ghost Story.
There's a huge amount of trust placed on you by us that you will represent it in a way that doesn't leave the family thinking they had a murderer in their midst.
There are things coming out here that are not terribly nice.
I don't think that helps anybody at all.
So are you saying you'd rather not know?
No, I'd rather it were not the case.
Follow Ghost Story on the Wondery app, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. Before you go, tell us about yourself by completing a short survey at wondery.com/survey. Ghost Story is a production of Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios. It's hosted by me, Tristan Redman. Our lead producer is Annie Brown. Our senior producers are Chloe Prasinos and Jess Hackle. Our producers are Zandra Ellen and Emerald O'Brien, and our associate producer is Natalie Peart. Joel Lovell is our editor, with fact-checking by Maximo Anderson. Theme song and music by Daryl Griffith, supplied by APM Music, with mixing and original music by Hannes Brown. Pineapple's head of sound and engineering is Raj Makija, with assistant engineers Sharon Badales and Jade Brooks. The senior audio engineer for Ghost Story is Davey Sumner. Jess Hackle was our senior producer of development. Our artwork was designed by Brian Kluge. Legal services for Pineapple Street by Rachel Strom and Sam Kate Gumpert from Davis Wright Tremaine, Crystal Tupia at Odyssey, and David Hurst from 5RB. Our senior producer for Wondery is Michelle Martin, with producers Brian Taylor White and Grant Rutter. Rachel Sibley is the managing producer for Wondery, and Sarah Mathis is the coordinating producer. Our executive producers at Pineapple Street are Maddie Sprung-Kaiser, Max Linsky, and Jenna Weiss-Berman. Our executive producers for Wondery are Morgan Jones, Rich Knight, Marshall Louis, and Jessica Radburn. Special thanks to Barb Fisher, Jackie Vegas, Casey Kaufman, Alison Vermeulen, and Barney Lee. This episode contains public sector information licensed under the Open Government License version 3.0.